Right, we're hoping to join the international affairs analyst, Dr. Marek Laskiewicz, imminently in London to give us his assessment of Srebrenica, what happened there today as far as this memorial is concerned, and what happened there 30 years ago when that horrendous massacre took place 3 decades ago. We're going to look at how that genocide has been marked. And also there is a lot of work going on at the moment to try to identify the victims. Many of them are still not identified. I think at least about 1,000 of them have not been identified and properly laid to rest. But as we mentioned at the outset, there were 8,000 men and boys who were executed by the Bosnian Serb forces in 1995. And of course, for the relatives of those people, I mean, some of them you can see there in that on the screen. It's an agonizing thing, just knowing that their relatives still have not been identified and who were probably killed in that awful massacre. But at least 2 international courts ruled that what happened in Srebrenica amounted to a genocide, and but of course it is still an issue in Bosnia. But let's talk to a man who knows more about these things than I do, the international affairs analyst, Dr. Marek Laskiewicz, who joins me on the line from London. Thank you for joining us. So just remind us of what happened in Srebrenica 3 decades ago.
Well, there was a country called Yugoslavia, which no longer exists, which was essentially run by the Serbs. But however, it had loads of different minorities in it, the Croats being perhaps the most well known, but the Muslims were there as well. And what had happened, not only during the Yugoslavia existed, but prior to that, there were all the communities had, so to speak, intermingled to the degree that there were Muslims living in the Serb areas and Serbs living in Croat areas and so on. The whole war was marked by if you like, the very term ethnic cleansing comes from that war, whereby the Serbs got rid of the minorities within their area that they wanted to keep of Serbia. Likewise happened in other areas in Croatia. So there was a huge swap of not only people, but of property between the Serbs and the Croats. Well, as bad as that was, it was nothing compared to the act by the Serbs that when they had Muslim enclave, they decided not only to expel everybody, but in particular to kill all the males, as the grown-up, the adults, and the adolescents. Quite why they decided to do this was unclear to this day, because other expulsions had taken place, please note, violently as well, but not on the scale of being an outright mass murder. It has been termed a genocide. We have a problem, or I do at least, with this, because there's a vast difference between the millions of Jews who died. We're talking about 6 million and 8,000 Muslims. But the term mass murder would certainly fit. And it was also done in cold blood, which was reminiscent of the previous mass murders, which had taken place in World War II, either by Nazi Germany or indeed by communist Russia, or there were others such as the Ukrainians or Poles. And therefore, to this day, it is a harrowing and sad part of European history. And the fact that there's an anniversary and the fact that people are coming to terms with this and the fact there's an investigation is very important. And the chief man involved was eventually, and the Serbs were eventually tried and convicted on the basis of genocide.
Well, thank you very much indeed for giving us that background, because there are a lot of people in many parts of the world who don't really know what happened. And we can see from those pictures earlier on the screen that genocide was being marked today. I understand that thousands of people came to the gravesite to pay their respects.
Yes, quite right. For the Muslim community, it was a very harrowing experience. One aspect of it, it has to be borne in mind, is that Europe is, in this sense, not so much strange as almost sense hypocritical, in the sense that tragedies here are very much magnified. And if we don't watch out, we'll miss real tragedies on a far greater scale elsewhere in the world. So it is quite correct to note this massacre, which is what it was, in cold blood, please note. It's quite correct to have this anniversary, but to remember that Europe has a way of going about things which Europeans can say, for example, without any problem at all, that the Russian-Ukrainian war is the first war since World War II, and miss out literally about 100 wars in other countries, including Africa, which somehow don't exist. And so therefore, it's good that they have this anniversary, and it's good they've come together. Please note the Serbs to this day have a slightly different view of this, because there were actually different acts of violence all around the place in this whole breakup of Yugoslavia, which sent shivers down the spine of everybody. Because if at that time the Americans said, if we don't watch out, Russia will go the same way, and it'll be a sort of Yugoslavia but with nukes. And this was a huge problem in the 90s. However, please note, cold-blooded massacre of 8,000 Muslims for no reason at all, in the sense they were not in any way engaged in a war with Serbia. They were not, they could have been quite easily, at the very least, expelled instead of being murdered. In this case, the massacre is not just bad per se, but to add to everything else, in a sense, pointless, which is even worse.
And I mean, the work to identify the victims is still going on, isn't it? There are still about 1,000 people who have not been identified and properly laid to rest. And for many people, I mean, that must be an agonizing wait, which is now sort of stretching into its 4th decade in terms of finding their relatives.
Yes, you're quite right on that point. I would add more to that. Actually, waiting is very bad, and to the point where some people would prefer to know that their relative is now dead. At least they can have closure. This, of course, pursues not just the Muslims, but, for example, the Poles. To this day, there are many Poles murdered to the east or to the west of Poland, and in my own family, for example, and we have no idea what happened to them. And I can tell you for a fact that, especially for the women folk, it is very bad, because at least there will be closure. In some cases, there are wives who never did work out whether their husbands been murdered or not, and therefore whether can remarry or not. These tragedies to this day carry on, and therefore one can only have sympathy for the relatives, especially the very close relatives of someone who was murdered, that it would be nice not only to have confirmation that he unquestionably died, but also to give him a decent burial, which is very important. As for the other implication about still people unidentified, this, alas, is all too common. In Poland, there's a whole organization, the IPN, dealing with this and identifying, if you like, people who have been murdered is difficult, and it does take a great deal of time and effort. And it is to the credit of the authorities that so many have been identified. And I would actually put it that way around, because it is hard to work out. But it is bad. There has been an attempt to the extent of punishing the perpetrators and also identifying the victims, which is laudable, but it does not take away the suffering for the people, especially for the relatives and the people themselves.
Indeed, and 2 international courts ruled that what happened in Srebrenica amounted to a genocide, and yet, as you mentioned earlier, it is a highly contested history among sort of many, at least in the Bosnian Serb community, isn't it?
Yeah, well, there's two aspects to it. First of all, what constitutes a genocide? What constitutes a mass murder? For example, in the air crash in Smolensk, which I assert in my books, Russia did it by means of a bomb. I would call this a group murder, not even a mass murder, because if we're going to contemplate the mass murder of the Jews, please remember 6 million, virtually the entire Jewish community in Europe, that's on a huge scale. And here we have a far smaller number. So, okay, if we're going to use the word genocide for that, we cannot at the same time call it a Holocaust like for the Jews because they're far greater numbers. Simultaneously, it must be recognized that an entire small community suffered a huge percentage losses, like the Jewish community in Europe. And therefore, in that sense, it is a genocide of this community. It is contested by the Bosnian Serbs, if only because, please note, one, there were other mass murders taking place between the Serbs and the Croats and the Bosnians at the same time. And two, if you're going to undertake a long-term view of the history, the entrance of the Muslims, for example, under the Ottoman Turks, was by no means a pleasant affair. And to this day, the number of atrocities occurred historically has to be borne in mind as well. And therefore, Srebrenica is bad, but viewed in a historical context. And the Serbs, of course, have long memories, and not just the Serbs, by the way, of problems between the Muslim and Christian communities. It becomes a far more contentious issue viewed in those terms. So therefore, it is good that it is good that there's discussion, and I would say the discussion is the most important because there are other aspects. One of the problems is because the Serbs are disliked by Western Europe, they are worried about the Serbs, between scared, because the Serbs are one of the few people who halted the Germans. The Serbian partisan movement, please remember the Croats were on the side of the Nazi Germany, actually halted them. And President Tito has halted the Germans, but as a result, the people of Western Europe, especially after going back still further, the assassination of the Archduke of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, who was going to become the emperor, all this means that the Serbs are seen in bad light. And you have to bear in mind, if you're going to be absolutely fair, that you have to bear in mind the entire history, including not only of that war, but of previously. And this doesn't really happen. So when you say the Bosnian Serbs don't entirely accept it, their point of view must not be entirely dismissed because there is an element of Western Europe simply not liking the Serbs. Instantly, the Serbs are usually on the Russian side, which doesn't help matters. So therefore, there is this, if you like, bias or potential bias to take into account.
Well, I mean, just briefly, what about the relationship between communities in Bosnia 30 years on? I mean, how are they getting along with each other? Are the divisions healing or getting deeper? Because, I mean, as we just mentioned, some still deny that any genocide or even massacre took place.
Yeah, there are the denialists. They're not all that serious in the sense they're like Holocaust denialists. They exist, but they're not taken seriously. A more interesting question is you have to take into all the events. But as for healing between divisions, it's not taking place in the matter you're implying. There was ethnic cleansing. There simply are no such many Muslim communities, often them at Croat Muslims in Serbia, often them at the Serb communities in Croatia. And so therefore, the healing has not occurred. What has happened is within each given country, Serbia, Croatia, and Bosnia, and so on, we now have, if you like, a situation whereby the ethnic identity of each country is more clear, and therefore there is no healing of divisions because there are no divisions to heal. Those people have left, albeit been expelled, to be more accurate, please note. At the same time, Bosnia does have, to this day, and Montenegro and so on, the problem the Bosnian Serbs and Kosovo is, of course, the key example of this. The divisions are, at present, if you like, hidden. They are there. The situation has not been resolved entirely. The Bosnian Serbs, not only are there some denialists, but more importantly, some people do not feel that Serbia is still entirely one nation or doesn't contain all the Serbs within it, and vice versa for others. So therefore, at present, it's peaceful. Don't count on it staying that way in the future. But as we stand, yes, it is a peaceful ceremony, and that the discussions are just that. There is no violence right now or to be expected in the near future. But do not expect this to last forever. The divisions between the communities are deep. The knowledge of history is deep. And so therefore, let us at least take pleasure in the fact there is peace and the people can come and visit these graves without fear.
Well, I mean, we're almost out of time, but let me just push you on that last point you made, because, I mean, it sounds like Bosnia is already dysfunctional. And I wonder if the point you're making is that there is fear that this could descend into something worse, because, I mean, they didn't think anything bad was going to happen in 1992 either, but it did.
Yes, quite right. The problem here comes from a very old event, which is not actually fully emphasized sufficiently. When, I realize this kind of strange, but it goes like this. When the American War of Independence broke out, France supported the revolutionaries against Great Britain. And in the peace treaty, it is something very strange. France made no attempt to recover Quebec. To this day, it's very proud of this. In other words, instead of asserting nationality, they asserted state, which state controls. But there is a problem. Not everybody feels like the French about this. And so when you have a state like Bosnia, which contains within it Bosnian Serbs and so on, it's forever, and not just Bosnia, please note. Other countries have the same problem. Please note in India recently, they're talking about disenfranchising many people in India because they came in as immigrants, Bengalis. The same problem exists everywhere. The difference between state and nationality. And therefore, there is this problem of Bosnia, so descending, but countries with minorities are forever have this danger. And the French solution, which England and Great Britain fully supported and implements everywhere, does not necessarily work out because people feel their nationality more than the state. And this is in effect what happened in Yugoslavia. The various nations separated out of what used to be a single state. And this is, of course, still remains a potential problem in Bosnia, and not just Bosnia. To date, in the world, there are many, many more such possibilities, including, of course, the famous problem of the Hutsis and the Tutsis in Africa, to name just one. But no, by the way, I've just said about the Bengalis. This problem exists elsewhere. And you could point out that, incidentally, when Donald Trump is acting against immigrants, that's not ethnic cleansing. But sure, it's not also all that far. The Gazans, for example, who may well be expelled, this is not clear what's going to happen at present, or are being asked to voluntarily leave. Same problem, different place.
A very important, timely history lesson. Thank you very much indeed. Dr. Marek Laskiewicz is the International Affairs Analyst. He was talking to me on the line from London, and you're watching The World.